At the height of British involvement in China, 1 in every 500 people on the planet was addicted to opium supplied by a single trading company operating under the protection of the British Crown. The East India Company did not stumble into the drug trade. It engineered it deliberately to solve a problem that had nothing to do with China's well-being and everything to do with Britain's trade deficit. When China moved to shut it down, Britain went to war twice, seized Hong Kong, forced open 5 treaty ports, and extracted concessions so humiliating that Chinese historians still refer to the entire era by a single phrase, the century of humiliation. How did a commercial dispute over tea become the defining wound of a civilization of 1.4 billion people? In this documentary, we trace every chapter of that story, from the candlelit drawing rooms of Georgian England to the rainy handover ceremony in Hong Kong, and we reckon honestly with what the British Empire left behind. In the middle of the 18th century, 2 empires faced each other across a vast and largely uncharted distance. Neither fully understood the other. Both were certain of their own supremacy. The Qing Empire under the Qianlong Emperor was, by almost any measure, the greatest power on earth. Its population had swelled to roughly 300 million people, more than the entire continent of Europe combined. Its territory stretched from the South China Sea to the frozen steppes of Central Asia, encompassing more land than any Chinese dynasty before it. Its silks, porcelains, and teas were coveted from Lisbon to St. Petersburg. And at the center of it all sat the Son of Heaven himself, the Qianlong Emperor, who had ruled since 1735 with supreme confidence in one essential truth: China was complete. It wanted for nothing. The outside world existed, if it existed at all, in any meaningful sense, merely at the edges of the civilized order. Britain, in those same decades, was a nation in the early grip of transformation. The first coal-fired engines were coughing to life in the valleys of Wales and the north of England. Mills and manufactories were beginning to reshape the landscape and the lives of ordinary people. Trade was not merely desirable for Georgian Britain. It was the engine of national ambition. British merchants, backed by the formidable machinery of the East India Company, were pushing into every corner of the globe, searching for markets, resources, and routes. And what did Britain want most desperately from the wider world? Tea. By the 1760s, the British were consuming millions of pounds of it annually. Chinese tea exclusively. There was no substitute. And alongside tea came silk, porcelain, and the whole glittering mythology of the Orient, a place Europeans had been calling Cathay since the days of Marco Polo, a land of impossible refinement and fabulous wealth that fired the Western imagination for centuries. But here lay the fundamental problem, the asymmetry that would define everything that followed. Britain needed China. China, quite genuinely, did not need Britain. Chinese officials looked at the goods British merchants offered and found them wanting. What could these cold, distant islanders possibly provide that the Middle Kingdom could not already produce for itself? The answer for most of the century was nothing. British trade was conducted on Chinese terms, through a single port, Canton, under a system of strictly controlled regulations designed to keep foreigners at arm's length. This was the world as it stood. 2 empires, one ancient and self-contained, one restless and hungry, separated not merely by 12,000 miles of ocean, but by entirely different visions of what the world was for. The collision between them was not yet inevitable. but the conditions for it were already forming. Tea arrived in Britain quietly. A curiosity at first, sold by apothecaries as a medicinal novelty, sipped cautiously in the coffee houses of London during the 1660s. But curiosity became habit, and habit became something closer to necessity. Within a generation, the British were drinking it at breakfast, at supper, in the afternoon, in the cold northern mornings that seemed to demand something warm and restorative. Samuel Pepys recorded trying it for the first time in 1660. By the 1780s, the nation was consuming roughly 13 million pounds of tea every single year. What happened to a culture in the grip of such a craving? It transformed. The tea table became the center of domestic life, a ritual of civility that cut across class lines. Aristocrats poured it from silver pots. Working women stretched their household budgets to afford the lower grades. Even children drank it. Critics warned that it was weakening the national constitution, draining money from the poor, replacing honest English ale with a foreign indulgence. Nobody listened. The leaf had won. The East India Company watched all of this with great interest. Founded in 1600 and granted a royal monopoly on trade with Asia, the company had evolved over a century and a half into something almost resembling a government. It had its own ships, its own soldiers, its own courts. And from the early 18th century onward, tea became the cornerstone of its commercial empire. Importing it was not merely profitable. It was, eventually, the company's single most important source of revenue. But importing tea meant dealing with China entirely on China's terms. The Canton system, formalized in 1757 when the Qianlong Emperor restricted all foreign trade to a single port, was a masterpiece of controlled distance. Foreign merchants were permitted to live and work only in a narrow strip of warehouses outside Canton's city walls, known as the 13 Factories. They could not enter the city itself. They could not learn Chinese, officially. They conducted all their business through licensed Chinese merchants called the Hong, who acted as intermediaries and bore responsibility for the foreigners' behavior. When the trading season ended, the Europeans were required to retreat entirely to the Portuguese enclave of Macau. It was a system designed to extract the economic benefits of foreign trade while keeping its practitioners firmly at arm's length. And for a time, it worked. Canton hummed with commerce. The Hong merchants grew spectacularly wealthy. The company's ships carried their cargoes home. The problem was payment. China wanted one thing in return for its tea, silk, and porcelain, silver. Hard currency. The Chinese economy ran on it, and Chinese consumers had no particular appetite for British woolens or manufactured goods. So silver flowed east, year after year, in staggering quantities. In the 1780s alone, the East India Company shipped millions of Spanish silver dollars to Canton annually. Britain was, in the bluntest possible terms, hemorrhaging its monetary reserves to feed a national habit. The trade deficit was not merely embarrassing. It was alarming. Company directors and government ministers looked at the ledgers and understood that this arrangement could not continue indefinitely. Something had to change. Some commodity had to be found, some lever applied that would balance the books and end Britain's humiliating dependence on Chinese goodwill. They had not yet found the answer, but they were looking for it with increasing urgency, and the search would take them somewhere neither empire could have anticipated. The The man Britain chose to solve this problem was Charles, Lord Macartney, a polished diplomat with experience governing Madras and negotiating in St. Petersburg. In 1793, he arrived in China commanding the largest European embassy ever sent to Asia. Nearly 700 men aboard a fleet of ships carrying an extraordinary collection of gifts intended to dazzle the Chinese court and demonstrate the ingenuity of British civilization. What did Britain bring? Telescopes and orreries, elaborate clocks and mechanical automata, a gleaming carriage with a suspension system unknown in China, a portable planetarium, and a hot air balloon, that most dramatic emblem of Enlightenment ambition ready to carry a man into the sky. These were not trinkets. They were arguments, carefully assembled, that the world had changed and that Britain led it. The gifts said, in effect, "Look what we are capable of. Now let us trade." The mission nearly collapsed before it reached the emperor. Protocol demanded that foreign visitors perform the kowtow before Qianlong, prostrating themselves 9 times with forehead touching the floor. Macartney refused. He would kneel on one knee, as he would before his own sovereign, but he would not prostrate himself like a vassal bringing tribute. After considerable diplomatic friction, a compromise of sorts was reached, though the Chinese records would later describe him as performing the full ritual. The argument over a gesture captured everything about the encounter. 2 empires, each convinced of its own centrality, unable to agree even on how to stand in the same room. Emperor Qianlong, then 82 years old and on the throne for nearly 60 years, received Macartney at his summer retreat in Chengde. He was gracious, even generous. And then he sent George III a letter that became one of the most remarkable documents in diplomatic history. China, the emperor explained with serene confidence, had no need of British manufactures. The empire possessed all things in abundance. It was, by its own nature, complete. The requests for a permanent ambassador in Beijing, for trade ports beyond Canton, for a relaxation of restrictions were all politely but absolutely declined. Qianlong was not insulted by the proposals. He simply found them unnecessary. Britain had sent its best argument and received, in return, a courteous dismissal. For 2 decades, that dismissal sat uncomfortably in London. Then, in 1816, Britain tried again. Lord Amherst led a second mission under similarly elaborate preparation. It ended even before it properly began. Amherst was summoned before the emperor at short notice, arriving exhausted and without his formal diplomatic robes. When he refused to perform the kowtow without time to prepare, he was expelled from the Forbidden City before the audience could take place. The mission achieved nothing. The humiliation was total. What is perhaps most significant about these 2 failures is not the ceremonies or the gifts or the arguments about kneeling. It is what they revealed about the widening gulf between 2 civilizations assessing each other across an unbridgeable distance. China saw a tributary state seeking commercial favors. Britain saw a closed door blocking inevitable progress. Both interpretations were sincere. Neither left room for the other. British frustration hardened after Amherst. The language in government dispatches grew blunter. The patience that had sustained decades of the Canton arrangement was thinning. Merchants, company directors, and ministers began speaking less of diplomacy and more of leverage. If China would not open its doors to reason and mutual benefit, perhaps it could be persuaded by other means. They were already searching for what that leverage might look like. And somewhere in the poppy fields of Bengal, the answer was quietly growing. The answer had been growing for years before anyone in London cared to examine it too closely. In the river valleys of Bengal and Bihar, British administrators had inherited something extraordinary from the Mughal Empire, a vast infrastructure for cultivating the opium poppy. The company did not invent this trade. They simply recognized what it could become. By 1773, under Governor-General Warren Hastings, the company formalized its control, establishing a monopoly over opium production in Bengal that would become one of the most profitable and destructive economic arrangements in modern history. The system worked with ruthless efficiency. Indian farmers, often bound by debt and contract, grew the poppies across tens of thousands of acres in what became known as the Bengal-Bihar-Malwa Triangle. The harvested resin was processed in Calcutta, pressed into balls weighing roughly 3.5 pounds each, wrapped in poppy petals, and packed into chests of 40 balls apiece. The company then auctioned these chests to private merchants in Calcutta, keeping its own hands technically clean of the smuggling that followed. Those private merchants, known as country traders, sailed the chests to Canton and sold them to Chinese distributors operating out of floating warehouses just beyond the Pearl River Delta. It was a masterpiece of plausible deniability. The company took the profit. Others took the risk. And China took the poison. The numbers tell a story of catastrophic acceleration. In 1767, roughly 1,000 chests of opium entered China annually. By 1800, that figure had risen to 4,000. By 1820, to nearly 30,000. By 1838, it reached 40,000 chests, representing millions of doses consumed every year by an increasingly desperate population. The drug moved inland along river networks, carried by merchants and boatmen who built entire livelihoods around the trade. In the cities and towns of southern China, opium dens multiplied. The sweet, heavy smell of burning resin became the signature of neighborhoods sliding into ruin. The Chinese imperial government was not oblivious. Edicts banning opium had existed since 1796, and the emperor strengthened them repeatedly through the following decades. Officials were ordered to seize shipments, punish dealers, and prosecute addicts. But the profits were too enormous, the networks too embedded, and crucially, too many Chinese officials were themselves corrupt participants. Foreign ships anchored just beyond Chinese territorial waters, beyond the reach of enforcement. Bribes flowed as freely as the drug. Every edict failed. The trade continued growing. Back in Britain, not everyone was comfortable with what was happening. Voices in Parliament raised the moral question plainly. Was it acceptable for a Christian nation to deliberately cultivate addiction in a foreign country for commercial gain? Critics pointed to the hypocrisy of a Britain that debated the abolition of the slave trade while simultaneously engineering mass dependency across an entire civilization. The merchants and their allies had answers ready. They argued that the Chinese government's corruption, not British enterprise, was the real problem. They insisted that the Chinese consumed the drug willingly, that demand existed independently of supply. Some pointed to gin consumption in Britain itself, suggesting little moral authority existed for lectures about intoxication. And beneath all these arguments lay a simpler one, rarely stated but universally understood. The opium trade solved the silver problem. It reversed the balance of payments. It funded the purchase of tea that kept Britain running. To stop it would be to unravel a commercial system that millions in Britain depended upon. Convenience, as it so often does, defeated conscience. By the late 1830s, the contradictions of this arrangement had become impossible to sustain. Silver was now flowing out of China rather than in destabilizing the imperial economy. A new emperor sat on the throne in Beijing, surrounded by advisors who understood that the drug trade was not merely a moral catastrophe, but an existential threat to Qing authority. He appointed a man of exceptional energy and determination to solve the problem once and for all. Commissioner Lin Zexu arrived in Canton in 1839 with the full power of the emperor behind him, and no patience left for accommodation. The collision that followed had been building for decades. Lin Zexu was not a man who trafficked in half measures. A scholar, a senior official, and a deeply moral administrator, he arrived in Canton in January of 1839 with imperial authority absolute and his purpose clear. Where previous commissioners had negotiated, stalled, and been quietly corrupted, Lin intended to act. His first move was extraordinary in its audacity. Before seizing a single chest, he wrote a letter to Queen Victoria herself, appealing directly to her conscience. He asked with genuine puzzlement how a nation that prohibited opium within its own borders could justify exporting it to destroy another people. He pointed to the laws of heaven and the principles of morality that Britain claimed to uphold. There is no evidence the letter ever reached Victoria. But as a document of moral clarity, it remains remarkable. A sovereign's direct accusation against a foreign crown made not with armies but with argument. Then came the siege. In March of 1839, Lin surrounded the foreign factories district of Canton, that narrow strip of warehouses and residences where European merchants conducted their affairs under careful Chinese sufferance. He cut off food supplies, expelled Chinese servants, and made the situation plain. The foreign merchants, British and otherwise, were not going anywhere until every chest of opium was surrendered. Trapped inside the factories, the merchants faced an impossible choice. It was Captain Charles Elliot, Britain's chief superintendent of trade, who resolved it for them and in doing so changed history. Elliot issued an extraordinary promise. If the merchants surrendered their opium to him as representatives of the British Crown, the British government would compensate them fully. He had no authority to make such a promise. He had no idea whether London would honor it. But it transformed private commercial property into a British government liability, and it guaranteed that whatever happened next would become a matter of national honor. Over 20,000 chests were surrendered. More than 1,400 tons of opium, the accumulated product of Bengal's fields and Calcutta's warehouses, passed into Lin's hands. He destroyed it all publicly, ceremonially, and thoroughly. At the coastal village of Human, workers spent 23 days digging enormous trenches along the shoreline. The chests were broken open, the balls of resin dissolved with water, salt, and lime, and the resulting slurry flushed out through channels into the Pearl River and the sea. Lin reportedly offered a prayer of apology to the spirit of the ocean for what was about to enter it. The destruction was complete by late June of 1839. In Beijing, the emperor was satisfied. In London, the merchants were furious, and Elliot's promise now haunted the government. The cost of compensation would be enormous, and someone would have to pay it. The confrontation did not end with the opium. In July, British sailors in Kowloon got drunk and killed a Chinese villager named Lin Zexu. Elliot refused to hand the men over to Chinese justice, conducting his own trial and imposing what Chinese authorities considered insultingly minor punishments. The incident crystallized exactly what had made the Canton system so perpetually unstable: two legal systems, two sovereignties, and no agreed mechanism for resolving the friction between them. Lin's response was to extend his pressure. He demanded that British merchants sign bonds agreeing to Chinese law and accepting the death penalty for opium smuggling. Most refused. When Lin moved to cut off trade entirely and expelled the British community from their refuge in the Portuguese territory of Macau, Elliot ordered the merchants and their families onto ships anchored in the harbor. By the autumn of 1839, the British presence in China floated offshore, homeless and furious, with nowhere to go. The fuse Lin had lit in Canton would burn across the Pacific to London, where Parliament and Cabinet would spend the winter debating what Britain owed its merchants, what it owed its honor, and what price China would be made to pay. The answer was already taking shape in the dockyards and barracks of a distant empire preparing to send its navy east. In the spring of 1840, the question reached Parliament: would Britain go to war? The debate was fierce, the outcome uncertain. A young William Gladstone, then just 30 years old, rose to deliver what many considered the most morally searching speech of his early career. He asked whether there had ever been a war more unjust in its origins, more calculated to cover Britain with permanent disgrace. He called the British flag in Chinese waters a flag protecting an infamous contraband traffic. The chamber was moved. But not enough. The vote passed by 9 votes. Britain would fight. The expeditionary force that arrived off China's coast in the summer of 1840 was a thing the Qing Empire had never encountered and had no framework to understand. 16 warships, 4 armed steamers, 27 transport vessels, and 4,000 soldiers drawn from India and Britain assembled with the calm efficiency of a machine. Their orders were surgical: blockade Canton, seize a northern base, and apply enough pressure to force negotiations. The first demonstration came quickly. In July of 1840, the island of Chusan, known today as Haoshan, fell in a matter of hours. Qing defenders manning the walls of Dinghai fired their matchlocks and lit their ancient cannon. British shells answered. The walls came down. The city surrendered. The entire engagement lasted barely a morning. But it was a single vessel that would most dramatically expose the chasm between the two sides. The Nemesis was unlike anything that had sailed these waters. An iron-hulled, shallow-draft steamer built by Laird brothers of Birkenhead, she drew only 6 feet of water and mounted 2 32-pound pivot guns on her deck. She was the product of Britain's Industrial Revolution applied directly to warfare, and she could go where no traditional warship could follow. Into rivers, up estuaries, around bends where wind offered no help, the Nemesis moved on steam alone. In January of 1841, the battle for the Bogue Forts brought these two worlds into direct collision. The Bogue, a narrow passage of the Pearl River guarding the approaches to Canton, bristled with stone fortifications that had taken years to construct. Admiral Guan Tianpei commanded the defenses personally, a brave man in an impossible position. British warships stood off at distances the Qing cannon could barely reach, while their own guns dismantled the forts systematically. Guan died at his post, refusing to retreat. He was one of the few acts of genuine heroism the war produced, and it changed nothing. The forts fell in 90 minutes. Canton itself was briefly threatened, then spared after a ransom was negotiated. But the war's decisive movement came in 1842, when the British shifted their attention north toward the Yangtze River. Their strategy was elegant and brutal. The Grand Canal, that ancient artery carrying tax grain from the rich Yangtze Delta to Beijing, crossed the river at a single vital point near the city of Zhenjiang. Cut that crossing, and the Qing court would feel the pressure not as a distant military embarrassment, but as a threat to the capital's very food supply. The assault on Zhenjiang in July of 1842 was the war's bloodiest engagement for both sides. Manchu bannermen, the dynasty's hereditary warrior caste, fought inside the city walls with desperate courage. Outnumbered and outgunned, many chose death over surrender, killing their families before taking their own lives. The British lost a relatively small number of men in the assault, but more to heatstroke in the furnace of a Yangtze summer. Zhenjiang fell, the Grand Canal was blocked, and British gunboats pushed steadily toward Nanjing. The Qing court had seen enough. What had begun as a policing action against foreign merchants had become something the empire could not contain, comprehend, or reverse. The emperor's negotiators arrived with instructions to settle on whatever terms they could manage. The treaty they signed would bear the name of a city the British had barely reached. Its consequences would shape China for the next century, and the bitterness it planted would outlast empires on both sides of the world. On the 12th of August, 1842, Chinese officials climbed the gangway of HMS Cornwallis anchored off Nanjing and entered a great cabin draped with the colors of the Royal Navy. They had come to sign. The document awaiting them was, in Chinese diplomatic tradition, a negotiated settlement between equals. What it actually represented was something entirely different, and the distinction would haunt every page of it. The terms were stark. The island of Hong Kong, already occupied since 1841, was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. 5 ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were to be open to British trade and residence. China would pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars to cover the cost of the destroyed opium, the debts owed to British merchants, and the expenses of the war itself. The Qing had lost a war they barely understood, and they were being charged for the privilege. Perhaps the most consequential blow was the quietest. The Canton system, that elaborate machinery of controlled contact that had governed all Western trade for over a century, was abolished entirely. The Qianlong merchants, the licensed intermediaries who had once stood between China and the outside world, were swept away overnight. China could no longer filter foreign access through a single port, a single guild, a single set of rules of its own devising. The wall it had spent generations building had been dismantled by treaty. And yet, the treaty left something conspicuously unwritten. Opium, the substance that had caused the entire crisis, the contraband at the heart of Commissioner Lin's campaign, the trade that Gladstone had called infamous from the floor of Parliament, was not mentioned once in the Treaty of Nanking. Not prohibited. Not regulated. Simply absent. The war fought nominally over trade principles had resolved none of the underlying moral questions. The traffic would continue, now sheltered beneath the architecture of formal relations. The Supplementary Treaty of the Bogue, signed the following year in 1843, deepened the wound. It introduced two principles that would define the age of unequal treaties for decades to come. The first was extraterritoriality. British subjects in China would be subject not to Chinese law but to British jurisdiction. A British merchant who committed a crime on Chinese soil would be tried by a British consul. The second was the most favored nation clause. Whatever privileges China granted to any other foreign power in the future, Britain would automatically receive. China had signed away not just rights, but the capacity to limit the erosion of rights. Other nations watched these negotiations with hungry attention. The Americans arrived in 1844 with Caleb Cushing leading a delegation that never fired a single shot and never needed to. The Treaty of Nanking gave the United States everything Britain had won and added the right for Americans to be tried in American courts even for crimes committed against Chinese people. Weeks later, a French delegation secured the Treaty of Whampoa, adding the right to build Catholic churches in the open ports. The cascade had begun. Every concession extracted by force became a template that others collected by simply asking. What had Britain actually built at Nanking? The foundation of a new order in Asia, one in which Western powers operated within China on Western terms. Hong Kong, that small, rocky, malaria-ridden island that Lord Palmerston famously dismissed as a barren rock with hardly a house upon it, would grow into one of the great commercial cities of the world, a permanent British toehold on the edge of the Chinese mainland. For China, the memory of Nanking would never fully fade. The phrase unequal treaties entered the language as a permanent grievance, a shorthand for the century of humiliation that Chinese historians and statesmen would invoke for generations. The terms signed aboard the Cornwallis were not the end of the story. They were an opening chapter in a long and compounding reckoning. The ports were open now. The merchants were coming. And in the years ahead, the question of what Britain truly wanted from China, trade, territory, or something harder to name, would grow more complicated still. The ink on the treaties was barely dry before the builders arrived. Shanghai in the early 1840s was a modest walled county town at the mouth of the Huangpu River. Its modest docks handling cotton and local goods, its streets unmapped by any Western cartographer. Within a decade, it would become one of the most remarkable cities on Earth, not through any Chinese ambition, but through the systematic construction of a foreign world within Chinese territory. The British settled north of the old Chinese city along a muddy riverbank they called the Bund. Then came the Americans, then the French. By 1863, the British and American zones had merged into a single international settlement governed by a municipal council from which Chinese residents were formally excluded, despite forming the overwhelming majority of the population. The French maintained their own separate concession nearby, flying their own flag and answering to Paris. Two foreign administrations had planted themselves in a Chinese city and declared their own sovereignty. The Chinese government had not been consulted. What rose along that riverfront was a deliberate performance of permanence. Neoclassical facades, gas lamps, a racecourse, churches in the Gothic style, private clubs serving English food and pouring Scottish whiskey. The architecture said in every stone and column that these settlers had not come to visit. They had come to stay, and they intended to govern themselves according to rules they alone had written. Extraterritoriality, that provision quietly introduced in 1843, revealed its full implications here. A British subject who assaulted a Chinese man on a Shanghai street would face a British consular court, not a Chinese magistrate. The victims of foreign crimes had no recourse in their own country's legal system. It was, as one contemporary Chinese official put it, a kingdom within a kingdom, a wound that did not bleed but never closed. And the opium kept flowing. The Treaty of Nanking had left the trade in legal ambiguity, which in practice meant continued expansion. Clippers unloaded chests at the open ports with the quiet confidence of men operating beyond reproach. British trading houses, Jardine Matheson prominent among them, built their Shanghai offices with fortunes accumulated through the drug. Not until the Second Treaty Settlement of the late 1850s would opium be formally legalized, placing official British sanction on what had never truly stopped. China's response to all of this was neither simple capitulation nor outright revolt, at least not immediately. A new class emerged from the friction, the compradors. These were Chinese businessmen who served as the essential intermediaries between foreign firms and the Chinese market, men fluent in both languages and both worlds, accumulating wealth and influence that confounded older social hierarchies. They were simultaneously collaborators and survivors, navigating a system they had not chosen but could not ignore. Beneath them, resentment gathered in quieter registers. Ordinary Chinese living around the foreign settlements paid rent, provided labor, and were barred from the parks their own taxes sometimes helped maintain. Signs reputedly barring Chinese from certain public spaces became one of the enduring symbols of this era. Whether strictly documented or mythologized, the image captured something felt to be deeply, viscerally true. Britain had come to trade, or so the argument had always run. What it had actually built along China's coast was something closer to a parallel civilization, one sustained not by Chinese invitation, but by treaty obligations extracted under the shadow of naval guns. The Qing court watched from Beijing, strained and uncertain. The foreign settlements were contained, for now, to the coasts. But the interior of China was restless for other reasons entirely, and the storms brewing there would soon drag Britain into conflicts far beyond any merchant's balance sheet. While British merchants counted their profits in Shanghai's counting houses, something extraordinary and terrible was stirring 500 miles inland. It had begun, improbably, with a young man and a failed examination. Hong Xiuquan had sat the imperial civil service examinations 4 times. 4 times the Qing system had rejected him. After his final failure in 1837, he collapsed into a prolonged fever during which he experienced visions, a white-robed man and a golden-bearded elder who called him son. For years, Hong barely understood what he had seen. Then a Christian pamphlet, picked up almost by chance, offered an explanation that would reshape the century. The elder was God. The white-robed man was Jesus. And Hong Xiuquan was therefore the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to purge China of demons and establish a new heavenly kingdom on earth. What might have remained a private delusion became, in 1850, a revolution. Hong's Taiping heavenly kingdom swept out of Guangxi province with astonishing speed. His followers, tens of thousands strong and swelling daily, were motivated by genuine religious fervor and by the grinding poverty and Qing misgovernance that had made millions ready to follow almost anyone promising something better. By 1853, they had captured Nanjing, China's ancient southern capital, renaming it the Heavenly Capital and installing Hong as its sovereign king. The Taiping state was startling in its radicalism. Land was to be distributed equally. Foot binding was abolished. Men and women were separated into distinct camps, even married couples. Opium, alcohol, and gambling were forbidden. Here was a Chinese Christian theocracy, puritanical and egalitarian in equal measure, governing a territory that at its peak held perhaps 30 million people. Britain watched with a mixture of fascination and calculation. These were, after all, Christians of a sort, or claimed to be. Might the Taipings prove better trading partners than the Qing? The British declared neutrality, sent curious diplomats to Nanjing, and waited. But what they found there was not a modernizing Christian republic. It was a millenarian court, increasingly isolated behind Hong's theological pronouncements, where the gap between heavenly promise and earthly chaos grew wider by the year. By the early 1860s, the calculation had shifted entirely. The Taipings threatened Shanghai. The foreign settlements were suddenly, directly at risk. Britain's neutrality quietly ended. Enter Frederick Townsend Ward, an American adventurer who had assembled a ragged mercenary force to defend the Qing. When Ward died in battle in 1862, his command passed to a 30-year-old British Royal Engineers officer named Charles George Gordon. Intensely religious, personally fearless, famously refusing any payment beyond his salary, Gordon transformed the force into the ever-victorious army and drove the Taipings back from the treaty ports with a combination of discipline and audacity that made him a legend in two countries. The rebellion finally collapsed in 1864. Hong Xiuquan, ill and increasingly erratic, died in Nanjing just weeks before Qing forces stormed the city. The killing that followed was merciless. The human cost of the Taiping Rebellion remains almost incomprehensible. Historians estimate between 20 and 30 million dead from battle, famine, and disease, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in all of human history, outpacing the First World War by a considerable margin. Entire provinces were depopulated. Cities stood empty for years afterward. Britain had helped extinguish the fire, but it had also watched it burn for over a decade while assessing its own interests. Charles Gordon returned home a hero, earning his famous nickname. The Qing dynasty had survived, battered, and diminished. And a court now dependent on foreign military assistance to suppress its own population would soon face Britain again, this time over the question of how much further foreign power could reach inside China's borders. Peace, if it could be called that, had never fully settled over China after the First Opium War. The treaty ports were open, the concessions granted, but British merchants remained frustrated. The interior of China was still closed to them. The Qing courts still resisted, delayed, and evaded. By 1856, the tension needed only a spark. On the 8th of October, 1856, that spark arrived in the form of a small, rather unremarkable vessel called the Arrow. She was a Chinese-owned lorcha, a hybrid sailing craft common in southern waters, registered in Hong Kong and therefore entitled, at least nominally, to fly the British flag. When Chinese authorities boarded her in Canton harbor and arrested 12 of her crew on suspicion of piracy, the British consul Harry Parkes erupted in outrage. The flag had been hauled down, he insisted. British honor had been insulted. The details under scrutiny were embarrassingly thin. The Arrow's British registration had actually expired. Whether the flag was flying at all remains disputed. But Harry Parkes and the Governor-General of Hong Kong, Sir John Bowring, were not men inclined toward caution. They escalated. They demanded apologies. And when the Qing governor of Canton, the imperious Ye Mingchen, refused to fully comply, British gunboats opened fire on the city. France joined the alliance with its own grievance. In February 1856, a French missionary named Auguste Chapdelaine had been arrested in Guangxi province, tortured, and executed by local officials. Paris demanded satisfaction. The cause of a dead priest and a dubious flag combined to bring two of the world's greatest military powers back to Chinese shores. In London, the war proved surprisingly controversial. When Parliament debated the Arrow incident, the Conservatives found their moment. Richard Cobden, the great free trade advocate, stood and called the whole affair a manufactured pretext, a disgrace to British honor rather than a defense of it. Parliament agreed, voting against the government. For a moment, it seemed the war might be stopped before it truly began. Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister, responded not by retreating but by dissolving Parliament and calling an election. He campaigned on patriotic grounds, framing his critics as friends of China over England. He won handsomely. The war would proceed. Anglo-French forces moved against Canton in late 1857. The city fell in January of 1858 after a sustained bombardment, and Governor Ye Mingchen was captured hiding among bags of rice in his own compound. He was shipped to Calcutta, where he died in captivity, having allegedly subsisted on food brought from China rather than touch foreign provisions. He became, in a strange way, one of the more dignified figures of the entire conflict. But Canton was not the campaign's decisive theater. The Allies turned north toward the Taku forts, the heavy gun emplacements guarding the mouth of the Hai River and the approach to Tianjin. In May 1858, after a fierce assault, the forts fell. The road to Tianjin was open. Suddenly, Peking itself felt threatened. The Qing court, shaken to its foundations, agreed to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of Nanking, signed in June 1858, which opened 10 more Chinese ports to foreign trade, allowed foreign ambassadors to reside in Peking for the first time, permitted Christian missionaries to travel freely throughout China, and enshrined the legalization of the opium trade. It was, on paper, a British triumph. But the Qing had not fully accepted these terms in their hearts. The ratification of the treaty still lay ahead, and with it, a confrontation that would bring foreign soldiers not just to the gates of Peking, but through them. The ratification meeting should have been a formality. Instead, it became a catastrophe. In the summer of 1859, a British and French delegation sailed north to formally exchange ratifications of the Treaty of Nanking. The Qing court, emboldened and resentful, had quietly reinforced the Taku forts. When the Allied fleet attempted to pass, the forts opened fire. The attack was devastating. 4 British gunboats were sunk. Over 500 men were killed or wounded. The Allies retreated, humiliated. Britain and France returned the following year with overwhelming force. By August of 1860, the Taku forts had fallen again, and a combined army of roughly 20,000 men was marching on Peking. The Qing court, desperate to halt the advance, requested negotiations. What followed was a betrayal that hardened British hearts beyond compromise. Harry Parkes, the same consul who had lit the fuse of the Arrow incident, led a delegation forward under a flag of truce. The Qing seized them. 39 British and French envoys were taken prisoner, bound, and subjected to deliberate cruelty. Many were left with their wrists so tightly bound that their hands rotted. 20 of the 39 died in captivity, their bodies returned in pieces. Among the dead was the Times correspondent Thomas Bowlby, the first war correspondent killed on duty in British history. When Lord Elgin, the British High Commissioner, learned what had happened, he did not reach for moderation. He reached for something calculated to wound the emperor personally, something that could not be repaired or ignored. The Yuan-Mingyuan, the old summer palace, was the emperor's private paradise. Over 150 years, the Qing had filled its 800 acres with hundreds of pavilions, pleasure gardens, artificial lakes, and priceless collections of jade, silk, bronze, porcelain, and manuscripts. It was, by any measure, one of the most spectacular places on earth. First came the looting. British and French soldiers moved through the grounds for days, filling their pockets, their packs, and eventually their ships. French troops took the larger share first. British soldiers followed. Officers selected the finest bronzes and porcelains. Rank-and-file men pocketed whatever they could carry. The treasures scattered across 2 continents. They entered French imperial collections, British aristocratic homes, and auction houses. Many reside in European museums to this day, their origins carefully obscured by centuries of acquisition. Then Elgin gave the order to burn it. For 3 days in mid-October 1860, British soldiers moved through the Yuan-Mingyuan with torches. The wooden pavilions caught quickly. Smoke rose so thick over Peking that soldiers miles away could not see the sun. A place that had taken generations to build was reduced to foundations and ash in 72 hours. Elgin called it a punishment aimed precisely at the emperor rather than the Chinese people. Whether that distinction comforted anyone watching the smoke rise is another question entirely. The emperor had already fled. Peking fell without further resistance. And in the ruins of that autumn, the Qing signed the Convention of Peking. The Treaty of Nanking was confirmed in full. The opium trade was formally legalized. More ports were opened. And the Kowloon Peninsula, directly across the harbor from Hong Kong Island, was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. The ruins of the Yuan-Mingyuan were never rebuilt. They stand today as a public monument in Beijing, a deliberate preservation of destruction. Chinese schoolchildren visit them still. In Chinese memory, the burning carries a weight that no treaty clause or territorial concession quite matches. It was not merely a military defeat. It was an act of cultural erasure, and it has never been forgotten. Britain now held Kowloon. The opium trade flowed legally. The ports were open. The question was what happened when China tried to hold back the tide by other means entirely. The ruins were still smoldering when China's most clear-eyed officials reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Military resistance had failed. Diplomatic maneuvering had failed. The empire could not fight the West on Western terms, and it could not simply wish Western power away. Something had to change. What followed was not a revolution. It was a rescue attempt. The movement that emerged in the 1860s gathered around a small group of reform-minded officials who refused to accept total helplessness. Prince Gong, the emperor's younger brother and one of the men who had negotiated the humiliating Convention of Peking, helped establish the Zhongli Yamen in 1861. It was a modest, almost apologetic institution by Western standards, but it was genuinely new. China's first dedicated foreign affairs ministry, an acknowledgement that the outside world was not going away. Around the same time, two formidable provincial officials were quietly building something more tangible. Zhang Guofan and his protege La Hongzhang had already proven themselves by crushing the Taiping Rebellion with forces they had largely organized and financed themselves. Now they turned those organizational energies toward modernization. Arsenals rose at Shanghai and Nanjing. Shipyards were constructed. Translation bureaus worked to render Western scientific and technical texts into Chinese, importing knowledge alongside machinery. And then there was Robert Hart. A young Irishman from County Armagh, Hart had arrived in China in 1854 and never really left. By 1863, he had become Inspector General of the Imperial Maritime Customs Service, a position he would hold for nearly half a century. In practical terms, a British subject was now administering one of the Qing dynasty's most vital revenue streams. Hart was meticulous, politically shrewd, and genuinely committed to Chinese stability. He modernized the customs service, suppressed corruption, and generated the reliable income that funded much of the self-strengthening program. He was trusted by Qing officials in ways that few foreigners ever were, and the relationship he embodied, intimate, useful, and deeply asymmetrical, captured something essential about Britain's position in China during these decades. Underlying all of this reform was a doctrine that its advocates never quite admitted was a contradiction. Chinese learning as substance, Western learning for application. The idea was surgical. Extract Western guns and ships and techniques, leave Western ideas and values at the door. Keep the Confucian social order intact. Modernize the tools without disturbing the hands that held them. It was a seductive formula. It was also, as events would reveal, an impossible one. For 3 decades, the movement produced real achievements. Factories, schools, telegraph lines, a nascent navy. But the reforms stopped precisely where they became genuinely threatening, at the level of institutions, governance, and the examination system that reproduced the ruling class. The surface changed. The foundations did not. Whether that was enough would not remain an open question for long. Japan had been watching, and Japan had drawn very different conclusions. Lord Palmerston was not impressed. When news reached London in 1841 that British forces had seized a rocky, largely uninhabited island at the mouth of the Pearl River, he dismissed it with aristocratic contempt. "A barren island with hardly a house upon it," he wrote. "It would never be a mart of trade. History would make him look foolish." The island was Hong Kong. Within a generation, it would become one of the most remarkable cities in Asia. The early years offered little promise. The climate punished newcomers with a ferocity that seemed almost personal. Malaria swept through the first British garrison, killing soldiers who had survived the Opium War itself. Pirates worked the surrounding waters with casual confidence. The rocky terrain offered no obvious agricultural foundation, and the handful of Chinese fishing villages scattered across the hillsides regarded the new arrivals with cautious uncertainty. Officials in London questioned whether the whole venture was worth the expense. But trade has its own momentum. The merchants came first, sensing opportunity where politicians saw only inconvenience. Jardine, Matheson and Company, already the dominant force in the opium business along the Chinese coast, established themselves on the waterfront almost immediately. The harbor was exceptional, deep enough for the largest vessels, sheltered from the worst storms, positioned perfectly for the commerce flowing in and out of Guangzhou. Stone warehouses rose along the shoreline. A city began to take shape, and it carried an English name, Victoria. The society that emerged was a study in ordered separation. At the summit of Hong Kong's steep hillside, quite literally above the heat and noise below, the British colonial elite constructed their homes in the district known as the Peak. The air was cooler there, the views magnificent, the distance from the Chinese population a point of deliberate design. By ordinance and custom, Chinese residents were effectively barred from living in the Peak District for decades. The racial geography of the colony was written into its very topography. Below, the real work of the city happened. Chinese laborers, called coolies by the British administration, built the roads, loaded the ships, and constructed the buildings where British merchants conducted their business. Chinese compradors, the indispensable commercial middlemen who understood both worlds, translated not just languages but entire systems of trust and obligation. A small Chinese merchant class accumulated genuine wealth, operating within British legal structures that offered protections unavailable elsewhere in the Qing Empire. They were subordinate citizens, but they were not powerless ones. And threading through all of it, for decades longer than the colonial authorities cared to advertise, was opium. Hong Kong was the logistical heart of the trade, the transshipment point through which tens of thousands of chests passed each year on their way to Chinese consumers. The revenues were enormous. The human cost, borne entirely by Chinese society, was not Britain's accounting concern. Legitimate commerce eventually grew large enough to stand alongside the drug trade and then to overshadow it. Cotton tea, silk, manufactured goods of every kind. The harbor that Palmerston had dismissed became one of the busiest in the world. Then came 1898 and a lease that would echo across the following century. Britain, watching the competing powers carve up Chinese territory with alarming speed, demanded a buffer zone around the island colony. The resulting Convention of Peking extended British control over the new territories on the Chinese mainland for 99 years. It seemed, in the imperial imagination of that moment, like permanence. In truth, it was a clock, already ticking from the moment the ink dried. The question of what would happen when that clock reached zero would not trouble the Victorians, but it would define everything that came after. The ink on Hong Kong's 99-year lease had barely dried when the full scale of China's vulnerability became impossible to ignore. The signal had come the previous year from an unexpected direction, and it had shaken the Qing dynasty to its foundations. Japan. Not a European power, not one of the great industrial empires of the West, but China's island neighbor, a nation that had spent barely 3 decades modernizing itself after centuries of isolation. In 1895, following a war fought largely over influence in Korea, Japan handed the Chinese military a humiliation so complete it stunned every chancellery in Europe. The Treaty of Shimonoseki stripped China of Taiwan, forced enormous financial reparations, and exposed the rotting interior of an empire that had long projected an image of ancient invincibility. If Japan could do this, the European powers began asking themselves, what might they accomplish? The answer came swiftly and it was not gentle. Germany moved first, seizing Jiaozuo Bay on the Shandong coast in 1897 following the murder of 2 German missionaries. Russia claimed Port Arthur, the strategically vital warm water harbor in Manchuria. France secured Guangzhou in the south. Each concession extracted from a weakened Beijing government came wrapped in the language of leases and treaties. The vocabulary of legality draped over what was, in plain terms, territorial seizure. Britain was hardly an innocent observer. Having already accumulated more Chinese territory and commercial rights than any other power, it nonetheless demanded its share. Weihai Wei on the northern coast of Shandong was leased in 1898, partly as a direct counterweight to Russian expansion at Port Arthur. More significantly, Britain claimed the entire Yangtze River Valley as its sphere of commercial influence. The Yangtze Basin contained perhaps the most productive agricultural land in China, and the river itself offered access deep into the Chinese interior. This was not a military occupation. It was something potentially more durable, economic dominance backed by the implicit threat of naval force. In drawing rooms and newspaper offices across Beijing and Shanghai, educated Chinese watched all of this through a particular lens. Political cartoons had begun circulating, most famously a French illustration showing the great powers seated around a map of China, each reaching forward to claim a slice. The image was precise and devastating. China was not a participant at that table. It was the meal. The Chinese term for this period, guofen, translates directly as carved up like a melon. Into this atmosphere of competitive seizure stepped the United States, arriving late and positioning itself rather cleverly. Secretary of State John Hayes circulated his open-door notes in 1899, calling on all powers to respect equal commercial access to Chinese markets. To some, it sounded like principled restraint, a check on naked imperialism. The Chinese who read it carefully understood something different. America was not opposing the carving of China. It was simply insisting on the right to sell goods into whatever slices the others had cut. Britain, for its part, found the open-door policy largely congenial. British commercial interests in the Yangtze Valley were already dominant. Equal access in a region where British banks, shipping companies, and merchants had spent decades building their networks suited London perfectly well. By the final year of the 19th century, China had been transformed from a vast empire conducting trade on its own terms into a patchwork of foreign spheres, treaty ports, and leased territories. The Qing court in Beijing retained formal sovereignty over a nation that was, in practical terms, divided. It was a situation that could not hold indefinitely, and in the summer of 1900, that instability would explode in ways that brought foreign soldiers marching toward the imperial capital itself. The frustration had been building for years, accumulating in the villages and market towns of Shandong province like water behind a cracking dam. The men who called themselves the Righteous Harmony Fists, known in the Western press simply as the Boxers, were not sophisticated political revolutionaries. They were peasants and laborers, drought-stricken and desperate, convinced that foreign missionaries and Chinese Christian converts had poisoned the very soil beneath their feet. Their beliefs combined folk religion, martial ritual, and a fierce conviction that their bodies, properly prepared through practice and prayer, could resist foreign bullets. The missionaries called it superstition. The Boxers called it power. Through 1899 and into 1900, they moved through northern China burning churches, killing Chinese Christians, and targeting the physical infrastructure of the foreign presence, telegraph lines, railways, anything that represented the new order being imposed on their world. The Qing court watched this movement with complicated eyes. Here, perhaps, was a weapon. It was Empress Dowager Cixi who made the decision that would prove catastrophic. In June of 1900, with Boxer forces flowing into Beijing itself, she made what historians have consistently described as one of the most reckless gambles in the history of imperial China. She declared war simultaneously on all the foreign powers with legations in her capital. Not one, not two, all of them. The consequences arrived with terrible speed. The foreign legation quarter in Beijing, a compact district of diplomatic buildings near the imperial city, became a fortress under siege. Roughly 900 foreign nationals and several thousand Chinese Christians crowded behind improvised barricades, while Boxer fighters and Qing imperial troops pressed against them from all sides. For 55 days through the scorching Beijing summer, they held. The world watched. Newspapers ran daily speculation about whether anyone inside had survived. In London, in Paris, in Berlin, and Washington, governments assembled what would become known as the Eight-Nation Alliance. British, American, French, German, Russian, Japanese, Italian, and Austro-Hungarian troops gathered at the coast and began marching inland. It was an unprecedented assembly of foreign military power directed at the heart of a sovereign empire, and it moved with considerable efficiency. On the 14th of August, 1900, relief columns reached Beijing and the siege ended. What followed was grim. Foreign soldiers looted the city systematically. The Forbidden City itself was occupied. Cixi fled westward in a cart, disguised as a peasant woman. The Qing dynasty had reached a low point from which it would never fully recover. The reckoning arrived in September of the following year. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 bound China to terms of extraordinary severity. The indemnity alone amounted to $333 million, a sum requiring decades of payments and consuming a significant portion of the Chinese national revenue. 12 officials were to be executed. Fortifications protecting Beijing from the sea were to be demolished. And in perhaps the most pointed humiliation, foreign troops were granted the permanent right to be stationed in Beijing, positioned directly between the capital and the coast. Britain received its share of the indemnity payments and secured its position within the protocol's framework. The legation quarter would henceforth be a formally protected foreign enclave inside the Chinese capital, a daily, visible reminder of who held genuine power. China entered the 20th century under occupation, in debt, and with its ruling dynasty visibly failing. The question being asked in Beijing's reformist circles was no longer how to manage the foreign presence. It was whether the Qing dynasty could survive at all, and what might replace it when it fell. The dynasty did not recover. Cixi died in November of 1908, having ruled China in one form or another for nearly half a century. She was followed to the grave by the Guangxu Emperor, whose death came just one day before her own, under circumstances that have never been fully explained. What remained on the dragon throne was a child. The Qianlong Emperor, better known to history by the name he would later adopt, Puyai, was 2 years old when he was crowned. Into this vacuum rushed the reformers. The decade following the Boxer Protocol saw the Qing court attempt, with desperate urgency, changes it had resisted for generations. The imperial examination system, that 1400-year pillar of Chinese governance, was abolished in 1905. Constitutional commissions were dispatched to study foreign governments. Provincial assemblies were established. The court was, in effect, trying to modernize itself before modernization made it irrelevant. It was almost certainly too late. Outside China, a different kind of solution was taking shape. Sun Yat-sen, a Cantonese physician educated partly in Honolulu and Hong Kong, had spent years raising money from overseas Chinese communities and organizing revolutionary networks. His framework, the three principles of the people, offered a vision of national unity, democratic rights, and economic reform. It was a direct rejection not merely of the Qing dynasty but of the entire structure of foreign privilege that had accumulated since the Opium Wars. Sun understood, better than most, that internal revolution and foreign dominance were two faces of the same problem. The spark came from an unexpected direction. On the 10th of October 1911, a garrison of Chinese soldiers in Wuchang, prompted by the accidental discovery of their revolutionary plotting, launched a mutiny rather than accept arrest. Within weeks, province after province declared independence from the Qing court. The dynasty had no loyal army capable of responding. On the 12th of February 1912, Puyi's regents signed the abdication documents. After 267 years, the Qing dynasty was finished. The Republic of China was proclaimed. Sun Yat-sen briefly served as its provisional president. And then, almost immediately, the new state's weakness became apparent. Real military power rested with Yuan Shikai, a former Qing general who maneuvered himself into the presidency within months. Beyond the capital, regional commanders governed as they pleased. The warlord era had effectively begun before the Republic had properly started. Britain watched all of this with the careful attention of a creditor observing a debtor's difficulties. The Foreign Office extended formal recognition to the Republic. British merchants and diplomats continued operating from Shanghai, from the treaty ports, from the Yangtze concessions. The unequal treaties remained in force. The indemnity payments continued arriving. Whatever government occupied Beijing, Britain's accumulated privileges in China were not part of any negotiation. The century of foreign dominance had survived the dynasty that had failed to resist it. The republic that replaced that dynasty would now face the same reckoning. By the 1920s, Shanghai had become something that had no precedent in human history. Not quite a city, not quite a colony, it was a place where the legal geography of empire had produced something genuinely strange. A metropolis of 4 million people governed by competing jurisdictions, competing currencies, and competing moral codes. At its heart sat the international settlement, administered by the Shanghai Municipal Council, a body elected almost entirely by foreign property holders. British nationals dominated its proceedings. The settlement had its own police force, its own courts, its own tax system. Chinese residents, who formed the overwhelming majority of the population, had almost no vote in its governance. The famous sign at the entrance to Huangpu Park, often quoted as reading "No dogs" or Chinese, was likely a myth in that exact wording. The reality was only slightly less insulting. Separate regulations effectively excluded ordinary Chinese from public spaces their own labor had built. The Taipans, the great merchant princes of the British commercial houses, lived magnificently. Along the Bund, the grand waterfront boulevard, the headquarters of Jardine Matheson and the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank rose in neoclassical splendor. Inside, deals were struck that moved capital across half the world. Outside a few streets away, children died of starvation in the alleys. Then came May 30th, 1925. Chinese workers at a Japanese-owned cotton mill had been striking for weeks. Demonstrators gathered in the International Settlement's Nanjing Road to protest the arrest of student activists. A British officer of the settlement police, outnumbered and apparently alarmed, ordered his men to fire into the crowd. 11 Chinese demonstrators were killed. The outrage that followed swept across China like a tide. Boycotts of British goods devastated trade. The May 30th movement marked the moment when Chinese nationalism shifted from a political tendency into a mass force. Britain's position in China would never fully recover its old confidence. Shanghai was simultaneously a financial capital, an opium distribution network, and a revolutionary hotbed. The French concession sheltered labor organizers and Communist Party cells. The same city that hosted the most profitable branches of British banking also hosted the founding Congress of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. Nowhere else on Earth compressed so much history into so small a space. The Northern Expedition of 1926 brought the challenge to foreign privilege into military form. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces marched north to unify China under Republican authority. Their advance sent tremors through every foreign community in the treaty ports. In Hankou, British concession territory was seized by nationalist crowds in January 1927. Britain, for once, did not fight back. The era of gunboat responses was passing. What followed in Shanghai that spring was not the revolution many had feared. On the 12th of April, 1927, Chiang turned on his communist allies with devastating violence. Thousands were executed. The left wing of the nationalist movement was crushed. The Shanghai Massacre, as it became known, brought temporary stability, but it also planted seeds of civil war that would consume China for the next 2 decades. For British merchants, the massacre was almost a relief. Chiang's nationalists could be negotiated with. Gradual treaty revisions seemed manageable. What neither the British taipans nor Qiang himself had fully reckoned with was the shadow lengthening from the north. Japan had its own ambitions for China, and they were not compatible with anyone else's. The playground was running out of time. The shadow fell first on Manchuria. On the 18th of September 1931, officers of the Japanese Kwantung Army staged a small explosion on a railway line near Mukden and used it as a pretext to seize the entire northeastern province. The League of Nations debated. Committees met. Britain, burdened by economic depression and no appetite for confrontation, offered no meaningful resistance. The League condemned Japan's actions, and Japan simply left the League. The lesson was noted in Tokyo and in Berlin. 6 years later, the shadow fell on Shanghai itself. In August 1937, Japanese and Chinese forces clashed in the city where British power had seemed so permanent just a decade before. The Battle of Shanghai lasted 3 months and killed roughly 300,000 people. The grand facades along the Bund trembled with artillery. Chinese nationalist forces fought with extraordinary tenacity before being ground down by Japanese firepower. Then came Nanjing. In December 1937, Japanese troops entered the fallen capital and unleashed 6 weeks of massacre and mass rape that killed somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 civilians. The world recoiled. Britain issued statements. Statements were all Britain could manage. The Royal Navy maintained a presence on Chinese rivers, and Japanese aircraft sank the British gunboat Ladybird in December 1937, wounding its crew. London protested. Tokyo apologized minimally. Britain accepted. The calculation was brutally simple. Fighting Japan meant exposing Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaya to immediate attack, and Britain already had Germany to worry about in Europe. The most humiliating concession came in July 1940. Under intense Japanese pressure, Britain closed the Burma Road, the vital supply route carrying weapons to Chiang Kai-shek's forces. For 3 months, Britain strangled its Chinese ally to appease its approaching enemy. Churchill, newly installed as Prime Minister, reopened the road in October, but the gesture of submission had been made and remembered. Then came the 25th of December, 1941. 18 days after Pearl Harbor, with Japanese forces having swept down the Malay Peninsula at devastating speed, the last British defenders of Hong Kong surrendered. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Nearly 12,000 British, Canadian, and Indian troops entered captivity. The civilian population of the colony, including thousands of British men, women, and children, faced internment at Stanley Camp, where they would spend nearly 4 years behind wire, surviving on starvation rations while the empire that had promised them protection ceased to exist as a functioning reality in East Asia. The men who had built their lives on Shanghai's Bund, who had believed in the permanence of treaty ports and gunboat diplomacy, sat in Japanese internment camps and watched the certainties of a century dissolve around them. The question was no longer how Britain would govern its position in China. The question, once the war finally ended, was whether there would be any position left to govern at all. The answer came before the war even ended. On the 11th of January 1943, Britain and China signed a new treaty in Chongqing, the wartime capital where Chiang Kai-shek had retreated with his nationalist government. With a stroke of the pen, Britain surrendered what it had spent a century accumulating. Extraterritoriality was abolished. British subjects in China would henceforth answer to Chinese courts. The treaty ports, the concessions, the special legal status that had made Britons in China effectively untouchable by Chinese law, all of it was gone. What had been unthinkable for generations happened quietly, without fanfare, because Britain had no choice. The empire was fighting for survival on multiple fronts. It needed China to keep tying down Japanese forces on the Asian mainland. Clinging to 19th century privileges while asking China to bleed for the Allied cause had become not merely embarrassing but strategically absurd. Chiang Kai-shek understood the moment precisely. His wartime diplomacy had achieved something Chinese statesmen had pursued for decades. By positioning China as a vital allied partner, he extracted the recognition his country had long deserved. Washington had moved simultaneously, signing its own treaty with China on the same day, and within months the United States pushed to have China declared one of the 4 great powers alongside Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. The humiliation of the unequal treaties was being formally unwound. Nowhere was this more visibly true than Shanghai. The Shanghai International Settlement, that improbable city within a city that had existed since 1842, formally dissolved in August 1943. The Japanese, already occupying the area since Pearl Harbor, transferred nominal control to their Chinese collaborationist government. It was a hollow ceremony, staged by an occupying power, but the symbolism cut deep. A century of foreign municipal rule over China's greatest city had ended. Churchill registered the shifting order that November in Cairo. Meeting with Roosevelt and Chiang Kai-shek at the Cairo Conference, the three leaders declared that Japan would be stripped of its conquests and that China would recover all territories seized by foreign powers. Churchill sat somewhat uneasily at that table. He understood the implications. A world organized around the principle of returning territories to their rightful owners pointed in uncomfortable directions. Which is why, when pressed on the matter of Hong Kong, Churchill refused to yield. The colony, still under Japanese occupation, remained in his mind entirely a separate question. He had not become prime minister, he reportedly remarked, to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. That single exception, that small rocky island and its strip of mainland territory, represented everything that remained of a century of British China. The treaty ports were gone. The concessions were dissolved. The gunboats had been sunk or surrendered. Hong Kong alone survived, waiting for the war to end and for the next argument to begin. The red flag rose over Beijing on the 1st of October, 1949. Mao Zedong stood atop the gate of heavenly peace and proclaimed the People's Republic of China to a vast, cheering crowd. After decades of war, invasion, and civil conflict, China had a new master. For what remained of British interests in Asia, the question was brutally simple: what now? Britain's answer came with surprising speed. On the 6th of January, 1950, London formally recognized the People's Republic, becoming one of the first Western nations to do so. The decision was pragmatic to its core. Hong Kong, that single surviving fragment of Britain's China century, sat directly beneath the shadow of a victorious communist army. Provoking Beijing seemed extraordinarily unwise. Better, London calculated, to extend recognition and hope for a workable relationship. Beijing's response was glacial. Mao had not forgotten the Opium Wars, the unequal treaties, or the century of humiliation that British power had helped impose. A diplomatic handshake from London was not forgiveness. Britain was acknowledged but not welcomed. No full ambassadorial exchange followed. The relationship existed on paper, frigid, and largely functionless. By then, Britain had already learned precisely how dangerous the new China could be. In April 1949, months before the formal communist victory, HMS Amethyst had been navigating the Yangtze River when communist artillery opened fire without warning. The ship was pinned down for 101 days, her decks bloodied, her captain dead. She escaped only by making a desperate nighttime run downriver in July. 22 sailors died. The Amethyst incident delivered a message that required no translation. The era of British gunboats on Chinese rivers was permanently finished. Then came Korea. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950, China eventually entered the war, pouring hundreds of thousands of troops across the Yalu River to fight against United Nations forces that included British soldiers. Britons and Chinese were killing one another again, and whatever slender hope existed for normalized relations evaporated completely. Hong Kong, meanwhile, was transforming beyond recognition. Refugees had been streaming across the border since the Civil War's final stages, and they kept coming. By the early 1950s, more than 2 million people had flooded into a colony designed for a fraction of that number. Squatter camps covered the hillsides. Factories began absorbing the desperate workforce. The quiet trading post Britain had seized in 1842 was becoming something else entirely. A vast, teeming, industrious city shaped by Chinese energy and British administration in equal measure. It was a strange inheritance. Britain had lost its empire in China but retained this one crowded fragment, now swollen with people who had voted with their feet against the system that replaced it. The next decades would determine whether Hong Kong was a relic or a beginning. By the mid-1950s, Hong Kong was running on desperation and ingenuity in roughly equal measure. The refugees who had poured across the border brought nothing but labor, and labor was exactly what the colony needed. Textile mills and plastic factories multiplied across the Kowloon hillsides. Toys, electronics, garments, goods stamped "Made in Hong Kong" began appearing in shops from Manchester to Melbourne. Within a generation, this overcrowded fragment of coastline had transformed itself into one of the great economic success stories of the 20th century. The Asian tiger was pacing its cage and growing stronger by the year. But 1967 cracked the surface. Across the border, Mao's Cultural Revolution was consuming China in ideological frenzy, and the fever crossed the water. Local leftists, emboldened by Maoist fervor, turned labor disputes into something far more dangerous. Riots spread through the streets. Bombs, some real, some fake, were planted on roadsides and in public spaces. 51 people died. For months, Hong Kong teetered on genuine uncertainty, and British administrators faced the unsettling question of whether they could hold the colony at all. They could, barely. The violence subsided. But it left a mark, a reminder that the border was never truly a wall. Beijing, for its part, chose calculation over confrontation. Even at the height of the Cultural Revolution's madness, China never moved to reclaim Hong Kong by force, though it easily could have. The reason was quietly practical. Hong Kong was handling roughly half of China's foreign currency earnings. It was a window onto the capitalist world, a source of intelligence, investment, and international connection that no amount of revolutionary rhetoric could replace. Mao's China was ideologically hostile to the colony's existence and economically dependent on it at the same time. This created Hong Kong's peculiar identity, a city of Chinese faces governed by British law, speaking Cantonese in the streets and English in the courts, watching Hollywood films and eating dim sum, celebrating both Christmas and the Lunar New Year with equal enthusiasm. It was neither fully British nor fully Chinese. It was something new, pragmatic, and adaptive, a culture built from the friction between two worlds. Yet the arithmetic of empire could not be wished away. The new territories, leased in 1898 for 99 years, would expire in 1997. And here lay the colony's essential impossibility. Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, ceded permanently under earlier treaties, were economically meaningless without the vast hinterland of the new territories behind them. A divided handover was no handover at all. Britain either negotiated the future of the entire colony or faced watching its singular urban miracle become ungovernable. By the early 1980s, the clock that had been ticking since 1898 was growing impossible to ignore. Two governments, one in London and one in Beijing, would soon have to sit down and decide the fate of 6 million people who had built a world neither side fully understood. On the 3rd of September, 1982, Margaret Thatcher stepped onto Chinese soil for the first time. She had arrived in Beijing as a conqueror of sorts, still glowing from the Falklands victory just months earlier. Britain had reclaimed territory by force in the South Atlantic. Perhaps, she reasoned, it could retain territory by argument in the Far East. She was wrong, and the signals came quickly. Descending the stone steps of the Great Hall of the People after her first meeting with Deng Xiaoping, Thatcher stumbled and fell to her knees before the cameras of the world. It was a fleeting, human moment. But in a city where symbolism is rarely wasted, the image traveled fast. The Iron Lady, kneeling on Chinese stone. Inside those meetings, the reality had been equally humbling. Deng Xiaoping was 78 years old, a survivor of purges and prison, a man who had watched empires and ideologies come and go. He received Thatcher with courtesy and absolute immovability. Britain's position that continued British administration might be preserved beyond 1997 was simply inadmissible. Sovereignty, Deng told her plainly, was not a matter for negotiation. China would recover Hong Kong in full. The only question was the terms. What followed was 2 years of painstaking diplomatic work, carried out against a backdrop of rising anxiety in Hong Kong itself. The colony stock market crashed in the weeks after Thatcher's visit, a pure expression of commercial nerves. Capital began moving quietly offshore. Questions that had seemed distant for decades now pressed urgently against ordinary life. Deng's genius, and it is difficult to call it anything else, lay in the framework he offered. Rather than absorbing Hong Kong into mainland China's political system, he proposed something he called one country, two systems. Hong Kong would return to Chinese sovereignty but retain its own legal system, its own currency, its own civil liberties, its own way of life for 50 years beyond the handover. The capitalist enclave would remain capitalist. The independent courts would remain independent. The arrangement was unprecedented in modern diplomacy, a sovereign state voluntarily partitioning its own governance to accommodate an acquired territory. Whether it was sincere or simply strategic would be a question for future generations to answer. On the 19th of December, 1984, Margaret Thatcher and Chinese Premier Zhao Ziyang signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration in Beijing. The agreement was formal and binding under international law. On the 1st of July, 1997, the entire territory of Hong Kong would pass to the People's Republic of China. Britain's century and a half of presence on that particular shore would end precisely on schedule. The reaction in Hong Kong was complex and not easily reduced to a single emotion. There was resignation, a recognition that the outcome had never truly been in doubt. There was anxiety, particularly among the professional and business classes who had built comfortable lives under British law and wondered what Chinese sovereignty would mean in practice. And there was emigration. Through the mid-1980s, steady streams of Hong Kong families began the paperwork for Canadian, Australian, and British passports, hedging against a future they could not read. There was also, for the first time, a serious conversation about democracy. If Britain was leaving, perhaps it owed its subjects something before the door closed. That question, left unanswered in 1984, would only grow louder in the years ahead. 13 years remained. And what happened inside those 13 years would shape the handover itself in ways no one in that Beijing signing room could fully anticipate. The rain began before dawn and never stopped. On the 1st of July, 1997, Hong Kong endured one of the wettest days anyone could remember. Streets ran with water. Umbrellas crowded every pavement. Dignitaries arrived at ceremonies with soaked trouser legs and dampened hair. Whether the weather felt like mourning or like cleansing depended entirely on who was standing in it. The tension had been building for years. When Chris Patten arrived as Hong Kong's final governor in 1992, he brought with him something Beijing had never anticipated, a genuine reforming instinct. Working within the limits of what the Joint Declaration permitted, Patten expanded the democratic franchise dramatically, lowering the voting age and widening the electorate for legislative elections. Beijing was furious. Chinese officials called him a sinner for 1,000 years. The carefully managed transition collapsed into open hostility. Patten pressed on regardless, understanding that whatever came next, he could not leave without trying. It made him enormously popular in Hong Kong and permanently toxic in Beijing. The farewell ceremonies on the night of June 30th were held at HMS Tamar, the British naval headquarters. Prince Charles stood alongside Patten as troops marched and the band played. The atmosphere was something between a military parade and a wake. After 156 years, the British were leaving with full ceremonial dignity, which is to say, with the particular English talent for converting loss into theater. Prince Charles had written privately about the occasion with rather less restraint. His diary, later leaked and published, described the Chinese officials present as appalling waxworks, and the whole proceedings as the Great Chinese Takeaway. The words were unguarded, personal, and deeply embarrassing when they eventually surfaced, a reminder that the formal composure of empire could coexist with considerable private bitterness. At midnight precisely, the Union Jack came down. The last British colonial flag was folded with careful hands and presented to Chris Patten, who held it and did not visibly weep, which appeared to cost him some effort. Across the harbor, at the new convention center jutting into the water like a wing, Chinese officials and guests erupted into celebration. Jiang Zemin, General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, addressed a global audience with words calibrated for maximum historical weight. This moment, he said, opened a new chapter for the Chinese people. For 1 billion viewers watching in mainland China, the narrative was unambiguous. A century and a half of humiliation, stretching back to the Opium Wars and the Forced Cession of 1842, had officially ended. The century of shame was over. Hong Kong was home. Chris Patten boarded the royal yacht Britannia, which pulled slowly away from the dock in the early hours of July 1st, lights glowing against the rain and the dark water. Patten was photographed with tears on his face, a moment of human undisguised grief that traveled around the world by morning. Britannia herself would be decommissioned before the year was out, a final punctuation mark on the age she had served. Hong Kong rose the next morning to new flags and new administrators. The legal system remained. The courts opened. The newspapers printed. Life for most of the 7 million people who lived there continued in recognizable forms. Whether Deng Xiaoping's promise of 50 years unchanged would hold was a question the handover itself could not answer. That answer would belong to a different century entirely, and to a different chapter of the long, complicated story between Britain and China. But 50 years did not hold. The promises made at midnight unraveled with quiet efficiency. For more than 2 decades, Hong Kong's separate legal system, Its free press, its independent courts, all survived in recognizable form. Then, in the summer of 2019, a proposed extradition bill brought millions into the streets. Protesters who had grown up entirely under Chinese sovereignty carried umbrellas and handmade signs, defending freedoms their parents had inherited from a colonial power they had never known. The irony was visible, uncomfortable, and entirely real. Beijing watched and concluded that what it was seeing was not protest but sedition. In June of 2020, the national security law arrived. Its provisions were sweeping. Crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces carried sentences of up to life imprisonment. The law applied to anyone, anywhere in the world, who criticized the Hong Kong government. It passed without any vote in Hong Kong's own legislature. By the time most residents read its contents, it was already in force. The free press contracted almost overnight. Opposition politicians were arrested or fled. The newspaper Apple Daily, which had spent decades as Hong Kong's most defiant independent voice, printed its final edition in June of 2021. Its press is running while its founders faced prosecution. 50 years had become 23. What does Britain remember about all of this? The record is, to put it carefully, uneven. The government offered a pathway to citizenship for holders of British national overseas passports, a gesture of genuine consequence for the hundreds of thousands who took it. But the deeper reckoning, the acknowledgement of what the Opium Wars were, what the looting of the Summer Palace meant, what a century and a half of extractive colonial power left behind, that conversation has never fully arrived. In Beijing, the conversation runs in the opposite direction entirely. The Summer Palace ruins were never rebuilt. That decision was deliberate. Broken columns and shattered pavilions stand open to the sky because China decided that some wounds should remain visible, that forgetting would be a second defeat. Every Chinese schoolchild learns the phrase, century of humiliation, a period beginning with the First Opium War of 1842 and ending, in the official account, with the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. That narrative shapes everything: trade disputes, diplomatic pressure, the fierce insistence on territorial sovereignty. History in modern China is not background. It is policy. The gap between what Britain remembers and what China remembers is not simply a gap between two national perspectives. It is a gap between a country that experienced empire as something it did and a country that experienced empire as something done to it. That asymmetry has never been resolved. It sits inside every negotiation, every diplomatic tension, every argument about museums that still hold objects taken by force from a civilization older than Britain itself. The story did not end in 1842 or 1997. It continues now, in contested harbors and unbuilt ruins, in the long memory of nations that have learned, for very different reasons, never to forget. Britain's shadow over China stretched across nearly 2 centuries, and its echo shapes the world's most consequential relationship to this day. Subscribe for more histories that the powerful would rather leave untold.